Well, there we go. There we go. Okay. So let me introduce our guest speaker, David Nicandri. He's a former Tumwater councilman and current Historic Preservation Commission member. He's an author. He's a retired director of the Washington State Historical Society, a very popular speaker, historian, and author. And the topic of his presentation today comes from his recent book, Captain Cook Rediscovered, Voyage to the Icy Latitudes. And I think you're going to like both his attitude and his latitude. So let's welcome David Nicandri. David, it's all yours.
Thank you, Don. There's that vintage Don Trosper humor. You ought to do a book on the humor in history.
Yeah,
no,
well,
wait, you've already done that. Sorry.
That's right. That's right.
Well, Don, I want to thank you, everyone with the foundation, the city, and especially my technical assistant here, Darlene Kemery, with whom I couldn't do any of these technical presentations in a Zoom environment. So Darlene, let me thank you again. Always appreciate your help. So let's go to the first. So this is the cover of my book, and we'll come back to that at the very end of the presentation. I just want to highlight the fact that the framework for my brief presentation today is a selection from some of the images and illustrations that are in the book, and that'll be my organizational arrangement. So Darlene, let's go to the first slide if we might.
Please.
So this is a map of the St. Lawrence River completed by sailing master James Cook, as he was then titled, in the during and just after the 7 Years' War between Great Britain and France, what we in North America know as the French and Indian War. Just to step back a bit, Cook was from Yorkshire in England, came from an agrarian background, actually, but not far from the North Sea, where he got started in the British coal trade. We've all heard the expression, not taking coals to Newcastle. He was in colliers, coal ships, started out taking coal from Newcastle to London. In the immediate run-up to the 7 Years' War, again, the French and Indian War, he shifted careers. He joined the Royal Navy. And his first assignment, coincidentally, as it turned out, was the British conquest of French Canada, culminating in the Battle for Quebec in 1759. The key to that battle was the British capture of the French citadel overlooking the basin more than 100 miles upstream from the Atlantic Ocean, Quebec City. The French were aware of the fact that the British attack was imminent, and so they pulled up all the markers in the St. Lawrence River, thinking that if the British sailors didn't know where the shoals and the rocks were, they could never get upriver of the citadel and attack it from behind. Well, the British Navy was smarter than the French gave them credit for, so they assigned a fellow, as it turned out to be, James Cook, who remapped the St. Lawrence River, put back in all of the markers so that the big, huge British Navy could sail upriver beyond the French citadel at Quebec City, and they were able successfully to attack the fort from behind. And in a very short battle, Quebec fell, and most of French holdings in North America in the ensuing treaty came into British ownership, with the possible exception of the Battle of Gettysburg. The Battle of Quebec in 1759 was perhaps the most important battle in the history of North America, and James Cook, in the fashion I've described here, played a central role by creating, in effect, a chart that would enable his Navy to bypass the French impediments, their attempts to obscure the river, and the British ended up prevailing in that battle. Next slide, please. Cook was immediately seen as an up-and-comer in the British Navy. So one of the other holdings the British reacquired from the French as a result of the treaty that ended that war in 1763 was the island of Newfoundland, seen here. Now, this is a composite chart that took 5 or 6 years for Captain Cook to create. It was his immediate assignment after the Battle of Quebec. Newfoundland had a notoriously vexatious coastline, as you can see from its complexity. Okay. The only straight edge on this image, and even then more or less so, is the west side. The south coast, the east coast, the northeast coast of Newfoundland is labyrinthine in its detail. It was newly acquired by Great Britain, and Cook's assignment was to depict it with a high degree of accuracy, which he did in this composite chart that was compiled on the eve, almost literally, of his next great assignment, which was to sail to the South Pacific. So in other words, Cook made his initial mark, the Battle of Quebec. He proved himself to be a master cartographer, both then and in the case of the Newfoundland map, which it took much of the decade of the 1760s to compile. And so in 1769, he was given a new assignment, the first of his 3 voyages to the Pacific. Next slide, please, Darlene. Now, this somewhat obscure image is perhaps not the best talking point to describe Cook's first voyage, but it's workable in some degree. I want you to remember the vagueness and sketchiness of this image, which is a French map prepared by a French explorer of New Zealand, which you see in Australia, which you see as Nouvelle-Hollande in the lower left, a sketchy outline of New Zealand to the right of that, and what we know today as Indonesia. Specifically, the sketchy nature of the division or lack of same between Australia and the island of New Guinea, plus the very sketchy outline of a few islands in the middle of the Pacific, one of which was Tahiti. This map was completed as a result of a voyage that was just prior to Cook's first voyage to the South Pacific by a French explorer by the name of Louis-Antoine de Bougainville. And one of the curiosities of history, actually, Bougainville had been one of the major French lieutenants in the catastrophic loss of Quebec in 1759. So he got a mission into the Pacific, an attempt to circumnavigate the globe, try to uncover some geographic mysteries. And then Cook, who they did not know each other at the time, was subsequently given a voyage to the Pacific as well. So again, you can see on the upper right, you can see a hint of Baja California, Mexico. But I just want you to remember the sketchiness of this bit of French cartography compared to what Cook would render over the course of 3 expeditions. Now, the point of Cook's first voyage was to go to Tahiti to take an astronomer there, more specifically to observe the transit of Venus, which is an otherwise obscure astronomical phenomenon that occurs on a 120-year cycle, during which the planet Venus passes across the face of the sun. If one were on the planet Mars, for example, periodically, episodically, one would be able to see from that vantage point Earth pass across the face of the sun as it did its annual rotation around the sun. Scientists, including Edmund Halley, better known for Halley's Comet, developed a very complex formula that hypothesized that if you could measure the time and angle of the Venus transit across the sun, you could calculate the distance of Earth to Venus, Earth to the sun, famously 93 million miles. And that was Cook's point in going on his first voyage, was to take an astronomer, although he was reasonably practiced in astronomy himself, was to take an astronomer there to measure the transit of Venus. Along the way, he also mapped in far greater definition, which we'll see in the very last image of this show, New Zealand and the entirety of Australia, its separation from New Guinea, and other very intricate details in the Pacific Basin. That was Cook's first voyage, the one of least interest for present purposes, but I just wanted to highlight that with this particular slide and brief discussion. Next, please. Cook's first voyage was considered so successful that he was immediately sent back into the South Pacific on a second voyage of exploration. Now, the Enlightenment era, of which Cook was a part, there were three great mysteries or geographic mysteries that kind of puzzled people. There was the transit of Venus, was the one we talked about that. That was the first voyage. The second great mystery or geographic puzzle was the question, is there a continent in the southern hemisphere that matches the dimension of the Eurasian landmass? Again, because the hypothesis was there had to be such a continent, in addition to South America and what little of Africa is below the equator. There had to be more land on the scale of Eurasia, it was thought. Otherwise, the Earth would wobble on its axis. So the continental land masses were balanced out approximately. And so Cook's second voyage was to try to address this long-standing puzzle of Enlightenment science. Was there another great southern continent? And so he was sent to the vicinity of New Zealand and Tahiti again. But his real goal was not in the tropical latitudes, but in the upper or the high latitudes of the southern hemisphere. And for the next 3 years, he crisscrossed the Southern Ocean, as it's known collectively or serially, the southern extent of the Indian, Pacific, and Atlantic Oceans in that order. Along the way, and here's the point of this slide, Cook and his men developed a novel way of rewatering the vessel because any ship at sea couldn't drink salt water. They had to have casks full of fresh water. And so they devised the method when they saw ice floating around in the Southern Ocean of taking a chunk from an iceberg, hauling it aboard ship, and melting it for their fresh water. That is the specific scene depicted in this image. Let's go to the next. But what puzzled as salutary as this novel source of fresh water was, what puzzled Cook and the naturalists that sailed with him was that there were these vast islands of icebergs. We know them conventionally as seen here, but they couldn't find the continent from which they emerged. And let me just briefly digress now into the theory of ice formation. Prior to Cook's time, it was thought that the icebergs and pack ice that sailors routinely encountered in the southern hemisphere, or for that matter, in the northern hemisphere around the Arctic Circle, that ice had to flow out of, it had to emanate from land, from a terrestrial source, because it wasn't thought at that time that salt water could freeze at depth. I mean, people knew that in shallow areas next to the Baltic Sea or the Northern Cape or around Iceland, people knew that salt water there would freeze, but it was thought that at depth, salt water couldn't freeze. And in fact, salt water does need colder temperatures to freeze than fresh water. We all know famously that fresh water will freeze at 32 degrees. Depending on the salinity of the water, salt water won't freeze until it gets to the low 20s. So anyway, so Cook and his generation are operating on the premise that these icebergs and the low pack ice are emanating from some terrestrial surface that is the balancing mechanism to Eurasia. But as they crisscross the Southern and Pacific Ocean, they never find any great extent of land in the icy latitudes, which is puzzling to them, which raises a question upon a question. If these icebergs aren't coming from land, where are they coming from? We'll get to the answer to that. Next slide. Cook's epiphany occurred here on his third year of exploration in the high southern latitudes off the island of South Georgia, which is southeast of the Falkland Islands and the high latitudes of the Atlantic Ocean. This island is more famous in exploration history as Ernest Shackleton's destination when his ship got embedded in the Antarctic ice pack and he sailed from Elephant Island, where they got stranded, hundreds of miles to a Norwegian sailing station on this same island. Now, this is an episode that's taking place in the first decade of the 20th century. Shackleton's able to get to South Georgia, an island that in fact was discovered by Captain Cook in early 1775 on the last year of his 3-year circumnavigation of Antarctica. Cook's epiphany occurred in this particular inlet because he saw a glacier calve off an iceberg. And that's when the light went off in his head. All of these icebergs that we saw all in the high latitudes of the Southern Ocean, sometimes hundreds of icebergs at a time, and also in the Southern Pacific Ocean, and thirdly, in the Southern Atlantic Ocean, the light bulb went off in Cook's mind. Aha, these icebergs break off from a terrestrial surface that interfaces with salt water, as seen in this image from South Georgia in the Southern Atlantic Ocean. And this led Cook to conclude that there had to be a continent at the pole. He couldn't find one in the mid to high latitudes like Eurasia that he was looking for, but he concluded accurately, without ever seeing it, there had to be a landmass at the pole because South Georgia was too small of a landmass to generate the great volume of icebergs he discovered on his second voyage. Let's go to a third slide. Next slide. And this is the last one from Cook's third voyage. One of the most remote places of the world, a place he called Southern Thule in the South Sandwich Islands, which are even further south and east from from South Georgia Island, almost on the same meridian as Cape Town in South Africa, but much farther south. And for a while, Cook thought that this may be a headland for the polar continent that he began to hypothesize existed at the South Pole, but in fact it proved to be, he thought, probably another remote island or chain of islands like South Georgia. And with that, Cook ended the second voyage by returning safely to Great Britain in the summer of 1775, having emerged, ironically enough, given his reputation as the great tropical explorer. Cook was beginning to establish a reputation as a pioneering polar ice scientist. And this, of course, is one of the larger themes of my book, as indicated by the subtitle, Voyaging to the Icy Latitudes. Okay, next slide, please, Darlene. Cook's reputation as a navigator and maritime officer by now was immense. He toyed with retirement, but as he himself said in a letter to a former boss of his, he has too active a mind to become an administrator of a seaman's hospital. So he took on the assignment for the third great quest of Enlightenment science, which was the existence or not of the Northwest Passage. So again, the first great Enlightenment quest, the transit of Venus, an astronomical experiment that would show the distance of the sun to the earth. Second great Enlightenment experience, Terra Australia Incognita, the great southern unknown continent. It doesn't exist, but Cook came up with a polar ice theory. The third quest is the Northwest Passage, which is one that we're probably all much more familiar with in this part of the world, since the northwest coast of North America figures prominently in this story. Now, I'm going to go through a cycle of maps here that give the shape of geographic understanding of the North Pacific in the decades just prior to Cook's third and last voyage, looking for the Northwest Passage. This is a map whose origins date to 1752. It shows the Northern Hemisphere, North America on the right, the Asian landmass on the left. That's probably roughly discernible. But I call your particular attention to the indent north of California. It's in French. If you look close, if you can magnify the image on your screen, you will see that this is titled the Mer de l'Ouest, the Western Sea. French cartographers were particularly fond of the idea that there had to be an analog to Hudson Bay, which is off the Atlantic. There had to be an analog to it off the Pacific, because this was kind of the same theory that informed the idea of a southern continent counterposing a northern continent. These were the great themes and theories of Enlightenment era science. Counterpoise was one, equipoise was another. So therefore, if there was Hudson Bay, there was a great big inland sea off the Atlantic, there had to be an analog off the Pacific side of North America. And that was of course one we now know that doesn't exist, but this shows the hazy degree of understanding of the western slope of North America in the decades prior to Cook's third voyage. Next slide. In the wake of Vitus Bering's voyages, Russian and German cartographers banished the idea of this inland Western Sea. You can still, in the upper extent there, you can still see Hudson Bay and Baffin Bay off of the Atlantic. But now we see that this kind of the rough outline, very elephantine almost in nature, taking the place of where we would expect the Alaskan subcontinent to exist. In fact, Alaska, as we commonly think of it, extends so far to the south and west, it actually tucks underneath the easternmost extent of the Far East Cape of Asia. Of course, we know that that's not true either. Cook, in fact, is the one that will figure this all out. But I just want to show you kind of the operating assumptions guiding geographers and explorers. This map, by the way, dates to 1767, almost on the eve of Cook's first voyage. And so then if we go to the next one, a map that was published literally on the eve of Cook's third voyage, where we see that great Alaskan protrusion to the southwest has been exploded into a series of islands. And in fact, Alaska, in this image, the largest of these islands, between the Asian landmass on the left and North America there on the upper right, in this image, published in 1775, Alaska is an island. I call more particular attention to an aspect of this map, this chart, where Bering Strait, Bering, by the way, saw parts of North America, but as you can see, this image and the one before it, how that was interpreted by cartographers was very sketchily displayed. But anyway, in this image, where you would expect to find Bering Strait, which today is actually at 168th degrees west. Bering Strait today, the meridian is the 168th meridian, more or less. In this chart, which was presumed to be the most modern chart of North Pacific geography published prior to Cook's voyage, Bering Strait, or its equivalent, the east side of the island of Alaska, is at 140 degrees west. In other words, the presumed gateway to the Northwest Passage is 28 degrees farther east than in fact it actually is, which we only know because Cook actually sailed there and answered the question once and for all. So let's go to Cook's third voyage, having gone through these prequels. This first image is one of the few that shows the Northwest coast. Again, Cook has been oft criticized by historians for almost a generation or more because he didn't see or didn't look for the Columbia River, didn't look for the Strait of Juan de Fuca. And that's because he knew, on the basis of explorations by a Hudson Bay Company explorer by the name of Samuel Hearn, who trekked north and west from Hudson Bay to what he thought was 72 degrees north, without seeing any river, without seeing any strait, and talking to Indians who did not know anything of a great passage or inland sea in those latitudes. And in fact, there was a big mountain range out west, what we know as the Rocky Mountains. Cook, on the basis of that information, did not even begin looking for the Northwest Passage until he got into Bering's previous zone of discovery, 60 degrees north or higher. Therefore, his only goal upon the coast in our part of the world was simply to land somewhere, get wood, get fresh water, and as it turned out, also get some furs for the cold weather farther north, which he accomplished as seen in this image at Nootka Sound on the west coast of Vancouver Island, which wasn't perceived as being Vancouver Island because it's called Vancouver Island because a subsequent explorer, namely George Vancouver, determined that this place and the adjoining land was insular in nature, not part of the mainland. To Cook, it didn't matter because he knew there was no way you're going to get to Hudson Bay or Baffin Bay by a passage in 46 degrees, Columbia River, 48 degrees, Strait of Juan de Fuca, or 50 degrees north by Nootka, because you're inevitably going to run into the mainland of the North American continent. So Cook sails from here in the spring, April of 1778, into what proves to be and is designed to be his actual zone of discovery, which is about 60 degrees north, Tumwater, in fact, Trosper Road, named after our host's family, and a little quirk of local historical fate. Trosper Road is precisely on the 47th parallel of latitude. I mean, exactly. The Canadian border with Canada's 49. Cook is going to sail all the way to 60 degrees north to the vicinity of Prince William Sound and Cook Inlet, where he's going to begin his exploration in earnest. Next slide, please, Darlene. One of the favorite themes in Cook historiography is to suggest that Cook wasn't as vigorous an explorer on his third voyage as on the first two, as evidenced by the fact he didn't find the Columbia River, notwithstanding that was not mission related, didn't find the Strait of Juan de Fuca, ditto, or the fact that he was killed at the end of the third voyage. All of that was evidence that he was somewhat of a diminished explorer and should never have undertaken the third and final voyage. But this chart of Prince William Sound on the right, what we know as Cook Inlet, he did not name it after himself. The Admiralty named it for him. He was in a way too humble to do that. This chart is as detailed and accurate as any in the entire 3-year voyage history of Cook's expeditions to the Pacific. But since we all know a Northwest Passage in those latitudes didn't exist, Prince William Sound on the right, Cook Inlet, proved to be dead ends. So Cook sails back out into the Gulf of Alaska and is looking for a gateway through the Aleutian Islands. Bear in mind, he's got Jacob Stalin's map of 1775 with this idea that Alaska is an island, which of course it's not. In fact, Cook is the one that delineates the subcontinental dimension of Alaska for the first time in an image we'll see here shortly. So Cook sails back out into this Gulf of Alaska, actually begins to trend southwest, not northeast towards the Atlantic Ocean, where the Northwest Passage is supposed to exist. finally finds an opening near what we know today as Dutch Harbor, and is able to sail into the Bering Sea, through Bering Strait, and to the north of Alaska, thinking finally he has maybe found the Northwest Passage. Next slide, please, Darlene. But Cook was sailing in what's known by climatologists and historians as the Little Ice Age. In fact, if you've noticed the weather here this spring, it's been colder than normal, which is a function of low sunspot activity. The Little Ice Age was brought on by what's called the Maunder minimum, which is a sunspot cycle where it correlates in a way that still scientists are trying to figure out, resulted in the Little Ice Age that lasted from about 1620, really until about 1850. So Cook's up there north of the Bering Strait in the heart of the Little Ice Age, and inevitably hits the Arctic ice pack depicted here in this scene. He can't find a way through the ice. He hits the ice a lot earlier than he expects. He got as far as 71 degrees south on his second voyage around Antarctica. And so therefore he was surprised to be stopped by ice at 70 degrees north on the northwest coast of Alaska, not quite as far as Point Barrow, but the cape that's just to the southeast of that icy cape, appropriately named, depicted in this scene here. Also call your attention to the right of this image. Down in the ice, you can see a hint of some walruses that are kind of huddled there on the ice mass. Cook, in another rather novel discovery, figured out that the walruses are always at the edge of ice. And in the fog-ridden shores of that part of the world, concluded that if you can hear the walruses barking, you know you're near the ice edge. And in fact, he sails hundreds of miles farther west from Alaska, actually atop what's now the far east Cape of Russia, basically Siberia, hoping to get around the ice edge, which track we can see in this next image, please, Darlene. So here you see the east part of Asia. This is one of Cook's actual charts. You see the narrow gap between the far west point of North America, called Cape Prince of Wales, and the Russian Far East Cape. Those little numbers, those are dates and soundings of Cook's track. And you see initially he heads northeast over what he hopes to fully transect, which is North America, hits the ice, and then notice his track west over the top of what's depicted in the map of part of Asia. Reading Cook's journal, I've concluded, as I write in my book, that if the way across the top of Asia had been open, in other words, if it hadn't been blocked by ice, as the top of North America was, he would have tried to have sailed home all the way to the North Sea, across Asia, top of Russia, Finland, Sweden, Norway, back to England. But he hit ice there as well, because it is, after all, the heart of the Little Ice Age. Someone sailing there now would never hit ice in those latitudes, because in this era of global warming, the ice, and particularly this part of the Arctic Sea, has receded farther in summertime, more so than any other part of the world. So again, pay attention. So pay attention here in this image to the lateral or horizontal track of Cook's ships leftward in the image once he hits ice above Alaska. Then he exits, comes back out, and in the lower right corner where it says shoaled water, that's Cook's survey of what we know today, which he named Norton Sound. By this point in time, all of Cook's men, were entirely exasperated and tired and fatigued by northern voyaging. But Cook spent another month mapping Norton Sound, thinking that what we know today as the Seward Peninsula, maybe somehow this was the island on that Russian chart we saw earlier. But of course, Norton Sound also proves to be a dead end. And so Cook sails to Hawaii to winter over in anticipation of another run at the north the following year, the summer of 1779, but of course is killed in the meantime in Hawaii, although Charles Clerk, his principal lieutenant, takes command and does try a second time in 1779 with similar results and returns home, neither one of them having found the Northwest Passage. So we come then to the last slide. Oh, the next slide. So this is from Cook's master chart. We're going to see the entire image on the next slide. But I just show this because if you remember that lateral horizontal line of Cook's encounter with the ice edge off Alaska and Siberia, note here southwest of South America, how it is distinguished from Cook's approach in the southern hemisphere, where you see that deep needle nose-like dive to the high southern latitudes, and Cook immediately returns. And that was his approach in the southern hemisphere. He'd go south, he'd hit ice, he'd return to warmer latitudes, travel eastward, head south again, hit the ice and go north. He did that in the southern Indian, Pacific, and Atlantic Oceans. But in the Northwest Passage voyage, he stayed along the ice edge for a month, not a day or two like on the southern voyage, looking for a way through and past the ice, which of course he could not find then because it was in the middle of the Little Ice Age. So that leads us to our last slide. I'm sorry, he dies in Hawaii. So we're going to skip over that quickly. This is Cook's chart. So I did want to leave time for questions. And so this is the master map of the Earth's surface as discernible at that point in time. There's no Antarctica yet. Charles Wilkes would discover that in the 1840s. Although, as I pointed out, Cook determined it had to exist as a source of the great fields of ice and icebergs in the Southern Ocean. But this map, with the image focused centrally on the Pacific Basin, I call in my book the first modern map of the world. You can see, remember that French map and its level of detail in the Southwest Pacific. Now you see the rough full dimension of Australia, what's called here New Holland. You see New Zealand, you see the alignment of islands in the tropical zone. About the only facet of the North Pacific Basin that is not roughly proximate to reality is that the Northwest coast is in fact more intricate than Cook depicted here with his relatively straight edge. But again, and people have criticized him for that, but I think unjustly, because the Northwest coast of North America was not mission related. It was the higher latitudes, that is to say, the Alaskan region. And here finally, we can finally see a rough approximation of the Alaskan subarctic, the Alaska subcontinent for the first time. And this map, by my reckoning, kind of sums up the three voyages of Captain Cook, centrally focused in the Pacific, but also in measure in the Indian Ocean and the South Atlantic Ocean, as previously described. And so that, in sum, is a brief history of Cook's three voyages. This map is otherwise noteworthy by its strict adherence to the grid of latitude and longitude. Remember those earlier maps? They got fanciful cartouches and little sketches here and there. this is strict Enlightenment discovery era scientific geography, strict adherence to latitude and longitude. And that was Cook's brand that he brought to the work of exploration and scientific discovery. So I'll stop there and hope that if I've passed over some themes too quickly, if there's points of clarification that can be made, I'd be happy to do so. Oh, yes, thank you, Darlene. All of this is covered in my book, which you can buy from the University of British Columbia, also at Amazon, Captain Cook Rediscovered, Voyaging to the Icy Latitudes. Don, back to you and our guest.
Great. Okay. Where did you, what was your sourcing? Let me get out of the share screen here so we can maybe.
Well, we might want to keep the share screen if there's a map we have to go back to.
Oh, okay. I'll get back to that. All right. I was just wondering where, did you have to go to England to go to find research and find all the log books of Captain Cook and all that stuff?
No, that's the wonders of the digital age. Of
Yeah.
course, Cook's journals have been published. You can get duplicate copies of the original editions of the public accounts at very economical cost. Lots of resources available online. So the truth of the matter is, Don, I never left the city of Tumwater. As far as I went from home was the Washington State Library, which is also in Tumwater.
That's right, it is. Yeah, good. Any other questions? Feel free to unmute yourself and ask away or make comments if you like. I don't have everybody's view here. Let's see. No, I'll go to this one. Okay, well, anyway, feel free to
Speak up.
Yeah, speak up. Unmute yourself and speak up. We'll have like an auction for David Nicandri questions here. We get going once, going twice. Anybody want to? Okay. As long as we have you online here, I know you're a part of the Tumwater Historic Preservation Commission along with me. One of the things we're starting to pursue is a different topic, is the Tumwater being the end of the Oregon Trail, the Cowlitz Trail, and maybe getting some signage on I-5, for example, talking about how it's the northern extension of the Oregon Trail and promoting Tumwater and its significance. And maybe you can comment a couple sentences about that.
Well, I'll just say this about that, Don, that that era of regional history was actually my first area of interest, kind of the pioneer period.
Uh-huh.
Very first thing I ever did was on the missionaries out of Priest Point Park. I got fascinated by Isaac Stevens and his railroad survey from 1853. I did the pioneer map of Thurston County back in the 1970s by stitching together the original government land office township survey plat maps, put them together as a composite. And that's where I detected what was then and there named as the Cowlitz Trail.
Yeah.
From the Cowlitz landing down by Toledo to Tumwater and Olympia. And so in a sense, I've returned to my original roots. That segment of the Oregon Trail doesn't have national designation. It's a grave oversight, and working with you, Don, and others, hopefully we can get some remediation on that score.
Yeah, well, Tumwater has a claim to fame that people don't realize how important Tumwater is to our state's history, and that being the extension of the Oregon Trail northward is one part of that. It was all British controlled territory until the Simmons-Bush party were allowed to go north. And so it's racism in Oregon helped to start Washington in a way, and then also the Olympia Brewing Company put us on the map as far as fame is concerned. But it's just neat to see little Tumwater being so instrumental in the beginnings of our state.
Well, we'll just keep working away at it, Don.
Yeah, we do. Okay. Any other questions, by the way? Any comments? Okay, I'm still not hearing any. Just have to unmute yourself. Okay. Not going. Okay. Well, David, thank you so much. And Darlene too, for helping out. It's just been a great pleasure to have everybody taking part in this. We do have another talk coming up, and you'll need to pre-register like you did here through Parks and Recreation to Tumwater. But it's Wednesday, June 8th, and we'll have the author and editor Sandra Kroll with their second printing of the Thurston County history book, Water, Woods, and Prairies. So she'll be talking about that. And so I hope you will join us again. Thanks again to all of you for your encouragement and your participation. And I'm going to stay active in my retirement, still doing history books and things like that, and talks. And Riverwalk tours too. You can also go through Tumwater Parks and Recreation for the Riverwalk live history tours along the river at the Falls Park or Brewery Park. So thank you so much for attending. And I guess we'll just, I see a chat. Do I see a chat down here? Let me look at that. Oh, Dave Shipley says, well done, Dave.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks, Dave.
All right. Okay.
Thank you, Don.
All right. Thank you all. And we'll maybe see you next month.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye. All right. Okay, I think there's just a couple of you still logged in. I'm going to go ahead and end it on my side. And so thank you again, and we'll look forward to talking to you in the future.